Yes, sir.
Lincoln suffered from some underlying medical conditions.
Yes, it's what has been almost wiped out, and I'm trying to remember of my reading, if it wasn't ultimately wiped out from most of us. It's called Marfan syndrome, M-A-R-P-H-A-N. It causes continued bone growth throughout your life.
Imagine having growing pains your whole life.
And we know from Lincoln's slanting forehead, his high cheekbones, his lantern jaw, that he did have, and he often talked about the crippling pains in his hands. In fact, the morning he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he'd been shaking hands for 3 hours. So when he sat down at the table to sign the Emancipation, he said, I have been shaking hands since 8 o'clock in the morning. If my hand shakes while I sign my signature, people will say he hesitated. So Lincoln actually grabbed his wrist so that he could steady his hand, so he could sign the Emancipation Proclamation and make it his signature and show no doubt that he was behind it. But that's one signal we had. We know that he could barely get off his boots when he would return to the executive mansion because his feet would swell up so much. So Stanton actually did him the favor of bringing in some Indian moccasins he could wear around the White House.
But they were too small.
And they were too small. So Lincoln just wore them halfway on his foot. You always knew it was him going down the hallway because he was just shuffling his feet along, trying to keep the moccasins along. But there's just all sorts of writing and things that lead us to it. Now in Chicago, we have the bloody sheets and the pillowcase, but
On which Lincoln died.
on which Lincoln died, but they were in other hands for a number of decades, hung above a fireplace. So the archives were compromised. So we put a question out to all these high school students in Chicago. Do you think we should take a 1-inch swab out of that blood sample, put it in an electron microscope, and see if we can't come down to the
Actually
answer?
cut the sheet and take a little bit out.
So what do you think the resounding answer was? Absolutely not. Not up to my generation, anybody's generation, to destroy archives. That's for our children's children. And then there was even a study done later. This was on the History Channel not too long ago, where they examined all the blood that was on Mary's, certain parts of her clothing, on
Her shawl and her
her
dress.
shawl and her dress, but nothing could even be authenticated as far as whether that was Major Rathbone's blood, Abraham Lincoln's blood, or what. So all these archives are never going to bring us any answer to this question. But I have been doing this for 25 years, and I can't believe how many doctors have come up to me in that time and said, you know, Lincoln suffered from Marfan syndrome. It tells me that it must be something they learn in medical school. And I don't want to correct him, but it hasn't been proven.
But then one of the other things.
And the other part of the disease, besides the bone growth, is it causes clinical depression. But I look at how strong Lincoln was and the fact that his heart kept beating till 7 o'clock the next morning. I myself have met some Marfan syndrome people. One was a young woman who had a number of operations done. Her kidneys, everything was stacked wrong. And then I met another 18-year-old boy that was introduced to me in high school. And he was so frail and so thin that when I put my hand on his shoulder, I just took my hand away. I didn't want to hurt him. So I'm confused, I really am, about the people I have seen with Marfan syndrome and to think that Lincoln had it. So it's an unanswerable question. I hope I answered that question.
Took them all, Mary.